I fumbled with the coffee maker, watching Angela try to pin her badge straight for the third time. Her hands shook just enough to make the simple task impossible. And I remembered that feeling. The weight of a new uniform, the desperate need to look like you belonged. Here, let me help. I reached over and straightened the badge with one quick motion. First day nerves never really go away, they just change shape. Angela smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Thanks. I keep thinking someone's going to realize they made a mistake hiring me. Knox doesn't make mistakes about people. I poured 2 cups of coffee, noting how she organized her equipment with military precision. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. That kind of thinking might actually help her here. But there are some things about working in Millfield that the Academy didn't cover. Small-town politics. She clipped her radio to her belt, testing the volume. I read about community policing strategies, building relationships with locals, something like that. I handed her the coffee and sat down across from her. The break room felt smaller with 2 people in it, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead like an angry insect. Angela, I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Don't interrupt, don't ask questions until I'm finished, and don't assume I'm joking. Her eyebrows went up, but she nodded. Between 3 and 4 a.m., you never leave your patrol car. Not for anything. Not if someone's screaming for help. Not if you see a crime in progress. Not if the car catches fire. You stay inside with the doors locked and the windows up. Angela's mouth opened, then closed. She took a sip of coffee, buying herself time to process. If you get a call about someone needing help in the woods, especially near Blackwater Creek, you don't respond. You log it. You acknowledge the call, but you don't go. The dispatcher knows this. Knox knows this. I'm telling you, so you know this. Harper, what? I said no questions yet. I kept my voice level. Professional. If you're driving on patrol and you see a tall figure standing on any gravel road, you turn around immediately. Don't try to get a better look. Don't approach. Don't shine your spotlight on it. Just leave. Angela set down her coffee cup harder than necessary. This is hazing, right? Some kind of initiation thing. There's a little girl who sometimes appears near the old train tracks. She looks lost, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing a white dress. If you see her, you observe from a distance and radio for backup. You do not approach her. You do not try to help her. Harper. Angela's voice carried a warning edge. I didn't come here to play games. Neither did I. I met her eyes, letting her see that I wasn't smiling, wasn't winking, wasn't giving her any signal that this was anything other than deadly serious. The last rule is the most important one. If you hear tapping on your car windows while you're on patrol, especially at night, you do not look. You keep your eyes forward. You don't acknowledge the sound, and you wait for it to stop. Angela stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum. Okay, I get it. The new girl needs to be scared into submission. Very funny. Sit down. Something in my tone made her pause. I'd used the same voice I'd used 3 years ago when I tried to warn Officer Martinez about the gravel road. Figure, he'd laugh too. Right up until his transfer request 2 weeks later. Angela, I know how this sounds. I know what your training tells you about helping people in distress, but Millfield isn't like other places. I rubbed my temples, feeling the familiar headache that came with this conversation. These rules exist because officers before us learned them the hard way. Some of those officers aren't with us anymore. She sat back down slowly, studying my face. What do you mean, not with us? I mean, they broke the rules and suffered consequences that go beyond getting written up or losing vacation days. I picked up my coffee, but didn't drink it. The bitter smell reminded me of the night I'd first encountered the window tapper sitting in my patrol car for 47 minutes while something circled the vehicle. Knox has been here 15 years. He'll tell you the same. Things I'm telling you, probably with more details about why each rule matters. This is insane. Angela shook her head, but she wasn't laughing anymore. You're talking about supernatural stuff, ghosts and monsters. I'm talking about survival. I stood up and walked to the small window that looked out over Main Street. Millfield looked perfectly normal in the afternoon light. A few cars parked outside the hardware store. Mrs. Chen sweeping the sidewalk in front of her restaurant. Kids riding bikes past the Methodist church. You can call them whatever you want. The labels don't matter. What matters is that you follow the rules. And if I don't, I turned back to face her. Angela had that stubborn set to her jaw that I recognized from my own mirror. Smart, determined, convinced that proper training and logical thinking could solve any problem. I'd been exactly the same way. Then you'll find out why the rules exist. I finished my coffee and rinsed the cup in the small sink. And once you find out, you can unfind out. Some knowledge changes you permanently. Angela was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup in slow circles on the table. How long have you known about this? 8 years since my first week on the job, and you've never broken a rule? I dried my hands on the paper towel, taking my time. Once the little girl rule 3 years ago. What happened? I looked at Angela's eager, worried face and felt something twist in my chest. She reminded me of Emma at that age. All curiosity and fearless questions. That's a story for another day. Right now, you need to decide if you can handle working here knowing what I've just told you. Do I have a choice? You always have a choice. I checked my watch. Our shift starts in 2 hours. You can spend that time thinking about whether you want to stay in Millfield or request a transfer to somewhere more conventional. Angela stood up and straightened her uniform, her movements sharp and decisive. I didn't come here to run away from difficult situations. This isn't difficult, Angela. Difficult is dealing with domestic violence calls or drug arrests. This is something else entirely. She met my eyes, and I saw the exact moment she made her decision. Then I guess you better teach me how to handle something else entirely. I nodded, feeling that familiar mix of relief and dread that came with sharing the burden. Get your gear. We're going to take a drive around town before our official shift starts. I'll show you the places where the rules matter most. As Angela gathered her equipment, I wondered if I was making the same mistake Knox had warned me about. But watching her careful, methodical movements, I thought maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time I could keep someone safe. 2 hours later, I was behind the wheel with Angela riding shotgun, both of us settling into the rhythm of night patrol. The streets of Millfield looked different after dark. Not threatening exactly, but expectant, like the town was holding its breath. So the 3 a.m. thing, Angela said, breaking the silence we'd maintained since leaving the station. What happens if you get out of the car? You don't want to know. That's not an answer, Harper. I turned onto Elm Street, our headlights, sweeping across empty sidewalks and darkened storefronts. It's the only answer you're getting tonight. Some things you learn by not learning them, if that makes sense. It doesn't. Good. Hold on to that feeling. Angela shifted in her seat and I could practically hear her brain working. She'd been like this since we left the station. Question after question, trying to build a logical framework around information that refused to fit into neat categories. The dispatcher really knows about the Blackwater Creek calls. Meredith's been here longer than any of us. She knows which calls are real and which ones aren't. How can you tell the difference? I slowed as we passed the elementary school, noting the warm light in the janitor's office window. Lauren was working late again, probably finishing the deep cleaning she did every few weeks. She waved when she saw our patrol car, and I lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel in response. "Who's that?" Angela asked. "Lauren Burgess, night. Janitor, she's good people. Does she know about the rules? Lauren knows what she needs to know." I accelerated past the school, watching the building shrink in my rearview mirror. Not everyone needs the full picture to do their part. Angela was quiet for a few blocks, staring out at the houses where normal people slept. Normal sleep without, worrying about window tappers or gravel road figures. I envied them sometimes, but not enough to trade places. "Tell me about the little girl," she said finally. I'd been expecting this question, dreading it since the moment I'd mentioned breaking that particular rule. "What about her? You said you approached her 3 years ago. What happened?" The old train tracks came into view ahead of us. Rusty rails, disappearing into darkness on both sides of the road. I pulled over and put the car in park, leaving the engine running. The headlights illuminated about 30 ft of cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds. She was standing right there. I pointed to a spot between the rails where wildflowers had pushed through the gravel. White dress, dark hair, maybe 7 years old. She looked lost. "And you got out of the car." I got out of the car. The memory felt sharp and immediate, like it had happened yesterday instead of 3 years ago. Knox had told me the rule, but he hadn't explained why it mattered. I figured a lost kid was a lost kid. Angela leaned forward, studying the empty tracks. "What happened when you approached her?" She watched me walk toward her. Didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with her hands at her sides. I got maybe 10 ft away and called out to her. Asked if she needed help. And she smiled at me. Then she was gone. Gone how? Like she ran away. Gone like she was never there. No footprints in the gravel, no disturbed weeds, nothing. Just empty air where a child had been standing 2 seconds before. Angela was quiet for a long moment, processing this. That's when you knew the rules were real. That's when I knew I didn't understand anything about this place. I put the car back in drive and pulled away from the tracks. Knox found me sitting in my patrol car an hour later, staring at that spot, and trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Why did you break the rule? Really? The question hit harder than I'd expected. I'd asked myself the same thing hundreds of times over the past 3 years, and I still didn't have a good answer. Professional instinct, I guess. Training kicks in when you see someone who needs help, especially a kid. The rule seemed arbitrary, compared to a child in distress. But it wasn't arbitrary. No, it wasn't. We drove in silence for a few minutes, winding through the residential streets where porch lights created small pools of safety in the darkness. Angela seemed to be absorbing everything, filing it away in whatever mental framework she was building. "Harper, look." I followed her gaze toward the tree-line at the edge of town, where something tall and dark stood motionless against the backdrop of pine trees. Even from a distance, I could tell it was wrong. Too tall, too still, shaped like a person, but not quite right in proportions. "Gravel road figure," I said immediately, turning onto a side street that would take us away from the area. "Don't stare at it, but we should investigate. We should follow the rules." I kept my voice calm, professional, but my hands tightened on the steering wheel. That's exactly the kind of thinking that gets officers hurt. How do you know it's dangerous if no one's ever investigated properly? Because the officers who tried to investigate properly aren't around to tell us what they learned. Angela twisted, in her seat, trying to get another look, but I'd already put enough distance between us and the figure that it was lost among the trees. "This is insane," she muttered. "We're law enforcement. We're supposed to protect and serve, not run away from things we don't understand. We are protecting and serving. We're protecting ourselves so we can serve the community tomorrow night and the night after that." I turned back toward the Maine patrol route, checking my watch, almost midnight. "The rules aren't about cowardice, Angela. They're about survival." "Whose survival? Ours?" The question caught me off guard. I'd never thought about it that way before. Whether the rules protected us from them or them from us. Maybe it was both. Does it matter? It might. I glanced at her, noting the determined set of her jaw. Angela wasn't going to be satisfied with simple obedience to arbitrary seeming rules. She needed to understand the logic behind them, even if that logic operated on principles that defied everything she'd learned about police work. "The rules work," I said finally. "That's all I know for certain. Follow them, and you go home safe at the end of your shift." Break them and you might not go home at all. But you went home safe after breaking the little girl rule. Did I? Angela looked at me. Sharply, but I didn't elaborate. Some consequences weren't immediately visible, and some kinds of damage took years to fully understand. I'd gone home that night 3 years ago, but I'd never stopped thinking about the child's smile or the way she'd vanished like smoke. We finished. The rest of our patrol in relative quiet, Angela asking occasional questions about patrol routes and radio protocols. Normal rookie concerns that felt almost refreshing after our earlier conversation. But I could see her mind working, cataloging everything she'd seen and heard, building theories about how it all fit together. As we headed back to the station at the end of our shift, Angela finally spoke up again. Tomorrow night, I want to hear about the other rules. All of them. Tomorrow night, you'll learn what you need to learn. That's not the same thing. No, I agreed, pulling into the station parking lot. It's not. I walked into the station expecting to find Angela getting ready for patrol, but instead, she was hunched over a stack of incident reports at Knox's desk, a yellow legal pad covered, in her neat handwriting beside her. Find anything interesting? I asked, though part of me hoped she hadn't. Angela looked up, pushing her glasses up her nose. These reports are weird, Harper. Like really weird. I poured myself coffee and sat. Down across from her, the reports she'd spread out went back at least 5 years. Missing person cases, noise complaints, welfare checks that ended with no contact made, normal small-town police work, except for the patterns Angela had apparently started connecting. Weird. How? Look at this. She pointed to a report from 2 years ago. Missing person call for someone last seen near Blackwater Creek, but there's no follow-up investigation, no search and rescue coordination. Nothing. Just a single report, and then it's closed. I knew that case. I'd taken the initial call myself, logged it properly, and then watched Knox quietly file it away. Sometimes people don't want to be found. 17 times in 5 years, all near the same location. Angela's pen tapped against the legal pad. And look at the timing. Every single disappearance happened between midnight and dawn. Before I could respond, Knox walked in carrying a box of donuts and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He took one look at the report spread across his desk inside. I was wondering when this would happen. Knox. Angela straightened in, her chair shifting into what I was starting to recognize as her interrogation posture. These incident reports don't make sense. There's no follow-through on any of the supernatural adjacent cases. Supernatural adjacent? Knox set the donuts down and hung up his jacket. That's a new one. You know what I mean? The cases that probably relate to Harper's rules. Knox glanced at me and I shrugged. I'd known Angela would start digging eventually. Her analytical mind wasn't going to accept the rules without understanding the system behind them. What exactly are you looking for, Angela? Patterns, context, some kind of logic that explains why these specific rules exist. She gestured at the reports. Harper told me the rules evolved over time, that officers learned them the hard way. I want to understand what those lessons were. Knox was quiet for a long moment, studying Angela's organized research. I could see him weighing how much truth she could handle against how much she needed to know to stay safe. The rules work because they're specific responses to specific threats, he said finally. Each one exists because someone before us encountered something dangerous and either survived to tell us about it or didn't survive, but left enough evidence for us to figure out what went wrong. Like the officer who looked at the window tapper. Knox's expression tightened among others. Before Angela could press for details, the station door opened and Sophia and Gwen walked in carrying a manila folder thick with papers. I felt my stomach drop. Sophia showing up unannounced usually meant she'd found something in the historical records that would complicate our lives. I hope I'm not interrupting, Sophia said, though she clearly had no intention of leaving if she was. But I found some things I thought you should see. Knox looked like he wanted to object, but Angela was already clearing space on the desk. What kind of things? Sophia opened the folder and pulled out photocopied newspaper clippings. Some, so old the text was barely readable. I've been researching the historical context for the phenomena you've been dealing with. These incidents go back much further than anyone realized. I leaned forward despite myself. The oldest clipping was dated 1952 with a headline that read, "Local man vanishes near creek." The article was brief, but it mentioned Blackwater Creek specifically and described the missing person as having been heard calling for help before disappearing. "This is from 70 years ago," Angela said, scanning the article. "The same location, the same pattern." It gets more interesting. Sophia spread out more clippings. 1967, 3 teenagers disappeared after investigating strange sounds in the woods. 1981, a state trooper abandoned his vehicle near the old train tracks and was found 3 days later with no memory of what happened. 1995, a family reported their daughter missing, last seen talking to a little girl in white near the railroad crossing. Angela's pen moved rapidly across her legal pad, connecting dates and locations. These aren't random incidents. They're following the same patterns Harper described, just spread out over decades. Exactly. Sophia pulled out a hand-drawn map marked with red X's. "I've plotted every incident I could find documentation for. They cluster around the same 5 locations, and they follow seasonal patterns. More activity in late fall and early winter. Almost nothing during summer months." Knox had been getting progressively more uncomfortable as Sophia laid out her research. "Sophia, I appreciate the historical context, but this changes everything." Angela interrupted. "If these incidents have been happening for 70 years, then the rules aren't just survival tactics. They're responses to something organized, something that's been active in this area for generations." I stared at the map, seeing my patrol routes marked in red X's going back decades. The gravel road sightings, the Blackwater Creek calls, the train track encounters. They weren't random supernatural events. They were part of something bigger, something that had been operating according to its own logic long before any of us were born. The rules evolved because each generation of officers encountered these same entities and learned how to coexist with them, I said slowly, the pieces clicking together in my mind. "We're not just avoiding random dangers. We're maintaining some kind of agreement," Sophia nodded. "That's exactly what I think. The rules represent boundaries that both sides have learned to respect. Both sides." Angela looked between us. "You're talking about this like it's a treaty." Knox finally spoke up, his voice careful and measured. "Because that's essentially what it is. The rules work because they establish clear expectations. We don't interfere with their activities, and they don't escalate beyond what the community can handle. What happens if the treaty breaks down?" "Look at 1978, Sophia said, pointing to a cluster of newspaper clippings. 7 disappearances in 2 months, all involving people who ignored local warnings about staying away from certain areas. The incidents only stopped when the police department implemented new protocols. Protocols that became our rules, I realized." Angela was quiet for several minutes studying the timeline Sophia had created. I could practically see her rebuilding, her understanding of our job from the ground up. "So when Harper broke the little girl rule 3 years ago, she said finally, it wasn't just dangerous because of what might have happened to Harper. It was dangerous because it could have destabilized the entire agreement." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I'd never thought about my encounter with the little girl in those terms, but Angela was right. If the rules were boundaries, in a larger agreement, then breaking them risked consequences that went far beyond personal safety. "That's why you were so worried about telling me the details," I said to Knox. "Not just because they're dangerous to know, but because they're dangerous to mess with." Knox nodded grimly. "Every rule exists because someone learned what happens when you cross certain lines. Some of those people survived the learning experience. Others didn't." Angela closed her legal pad and looked around at all of us. "So our job isn't really law enforcement in any traditional sense. We're peacekeepers in a conflict most people don't know exists. Welcome to Millfield, Knox said dryly. Sophia gathered her papers back into the folder. I'll keep researching the historical patterns. If we understand how this agreement developed, we might be able to predict when it's under stress. After she left, the three of us sat in the station's fluorescent lighting, processing what we'd learned. Angela's research had revealed something I'd never fully grasped in 8 years of following the rules. We weren't just surviving supernatural encounters. We were maintaining a balance that protected the entire community. Ready for patrol? Knox asked, checking his watch. Angela stood up and straightened her uniform, more ready than I was yesterday. As we headed out to the patrol car, I realized that Angela's analytical approach had given us something I'd never had before: context. The rules weren't arbitrary survival tactics imposed by paranoid supervisors. They were the result of decades of trial and error, negotiated in blood and disappearances by officers who'd learned to coexist with something that defied every assumption about how the world worked. Harper, Angela said as we got into the car, tomorrow I want to map out our patrol routes against Sophia's incident locations. If we're maintaining a treaty, we should understand the territory it covers. I started the engine, feeling something shift in how I thought about our work. For 8 years, I'd followed the rules because they kept me alive. Now I understood that following them kept everyone alive. Tomorrow, I agreed. But tonight, we just drive the routes and keep the peace. The radio crackled to life at 3:17 a.m., just as I was telling Angela about the Methodist Church's history with late-night incidents. We were parked across from the white clapboard building, its steeple cutting, a dark line against the star-filled sky. Unit 12. We have a tap, tap, tap. The sound came from Angela's window, soft but deliberate. 3 measured knocks, like someone asking politely to be let in. Angela's head started to turn toward the sound, and I grabbed her arm hard enough to leave. Marks, don't. My voice came out sharper than I'd intended. Eyes forward. Don't look. Tap, tap, tap. The sound moved to the rear window, then to my side of the car. Angela's breathing had gone shallow and I could feel her muscles tensing under my grip. Harper, someone's out there. We need to sit still and wait for it to stop. Tap, tap, tap. Now it was on the windshield directly in front of us. I kept my eyes fixed on the church's front door, counting the white paint chips on the wooden steps. Angela was shaking now, her training screaming at her to investigate, to help, to do something other than sit like a target. "This is insane," she whispered. "We're police officers. We don't hide from tap, tap, tap." The sound circled back to her window, more insistent this time. Whatever was out there knew we could hear it. Maybe it knew we were struggling not to look. "Harper, please just tell me what's out there." I don't know. And that was the truth. I'd never looked either. Never been tempted enough to risk finding out. Knox told me about an officer who turned to see what was tapping. Said the guy was never the same after. What does that mean? Tap, tap, tap. It means he finished his shift that night, went home to his wife and kids, and never spoke another word to anyone. Not his family, not his partner, not the department psychologist. Just silence for the rest of his life. Angela's hand moved toward the window and I tightened my grip on her arm. Don't even think about it. The tapping continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. It moved around the car in a pattern. 3 taps on each window, then the roof, then back to the windows, methodical, patient, like it had all the time in the world to wait for us to break. Angela had stopped shaking, but I could feel her pulse hammering against my fingers. She was fighting every instinct she'd developed in her training, every protective impulse that made her want to be a cop in the first place. "How do you stand it?" she asked quietly. "You learn to think about other things, count something, recite the alphabet backwards, anything to keep your mind busy until it stops. Tap, tap, tap. What if it doesn't stop? It always stops." And then it did. The silence felt almost violent after the rhythmic tapping, like someone had suddenly turned off. Music you'd been hearing for hours. I waited another 5 minutes, counting my heartbeats before I trusted myself to start the car. "Is it gone?" Angela asked. "Probably." I pulled away from the church slowly, checking my mirrors out of habit rather than any real desire to see what might be back there. "But we're not talking about it anymore tonight." Angela nodded, though I could see her hand still trembling as she tried to write something in her patrol log. She gave up after the pen slipped from her fingers twice. We drove in silence for 20 minutes, both of us trying to process what had just happened. I was proud of Angela for not looking, but I could see the experience had shaken something loose in her understanding of what our job actually required. The radio crackled again at 3:47 a.m. "Any unit available, we have a report of someone in distress near Blackwater Creek. Caller reports hearing cries for help coming from the woods." Angela's hand moved toward the radio before I could stop her. "Unit 12 responding." I grabbed the radio out of her hand and clicked it off. "What are you doing?" Angela stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Someone needs help. No one needs help. You." "Heard the call. Someone's in distress near the creek." "I heard a call that matches exactly what I told you about on your first day." The calls that sound real, but aren't. Angela reached for the radio again, and I held it away from her. "Harper, this is our job. We respond to calls for help. Not this call." The radio crackled again, and dispatch repeated the information. This time we could hear something in the background of the call. A voice, distant but clear, calling for help. It sounded young, maybe a teenager and scared. "Please," the voice said through the static. "I'm lost. I can't find my way out." Angela's face went white. "That's a kid, Harper. A kid who's lost. In the woods." "It's not a kid. How can you be sure?" "Because I've heard this exact call 17 times in 8 years, and every time an officer responded, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of disturbance, no missing person reports that matched." The voice. The radio crackled a third time. The voice was clearer now, more desperate. "Help me, please. I'm so cold." Angela was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she listened to what sounded like a child in genuine distress. Every protective instinct she had was screaming at her to respond, to help, to do something other than sit in our patrol car and listen to someone suffer. "This is wrong," she whispered. "This is so wrong." "I know. Then why aren't we doing anything?" "Because the officers who tried to do something came back different, or they didn't come back at all." The calls continued for another 10 minutes, growing more desperate, more heartbreaking. The voice described being cold, being lost, being afraid of things moving in the darkness. It was everything designed to make a police officer abandon caution and rush to help. Angela had her hands pressed over her ears, but she could still hear it. We both could. "Make it stop," she said. "I can't." "Then drive away. Please, just drive away, so we can't hear it anymore." I started the car and headed toward the other side of town, but the radio followed us. The voice seemed to know we were listening, seemed to be speaking directly to us. "I can see your lights," it said. "Please don't leave me here." Angela made a sound like she was being physically hurt. "Harper, what if it's real? What if this one time it's actually real and we're abandoning someone who needs us? Then we're following the rules that have kept this town safe for decades. Safe from what? I don't know, and I don't want to find out." The calls finally stopped at 4:23 a.m., cutting off mid-sentence as the voice was describing something approaching through the trees. The silence that followed felt different from the silence after the window tapping, heavier, more final. Angela sat in the passenger seat, staring at the radio like it had personally betrayed her. "I became a cop to help people." "You are helping people. You're helping by not making things worse. How is ignoring someone in distress helping? Because responding to that call wouldn't have helped anyone." It would have put you in danger and potentially destabilized something that's been working for longer than either of us has been alive. Angela was quiet for the rest of our shift, processing what she'd experienced. I could see her rebuilding her understanding of police work from the ground up, trying to reconcile her training with the reality of what our job actually required in Millfield. As we headed back to the station at dawn, she finally spoke again. The officer who looked at the window tapper, what was his name? David Chen. He transferred to Augusta 6 months later, but Knox stayed in touch with his family. His wife said he never spoke again, not even to say goodbye when he left. And the officers who responded to the Blackwater Creek calls, some transferred, some just disappeared one night and never came back. Angela nodded slowly, filing this information away with everything else she was learning about the cost of curiosity in our line of work. "Tomorrow night," she said as we pulled into the station parking lot, "I want to understand why the rules work. Not just that they work, but why these specific boundaries matter." "Tomorrow night," I agreed, though I wasn't sure I had those answers either. As Angela gathered her gear and headed to her car, I realized that she'd passed her first real test. She'd heard the window tapper and hadn't looked. She'd listened to the Blackwater Creek calls and hadn't responded. She was learning to be the kind of officer who could survive in Millfield. But I could see the cost of that learning in the way her shoulders sagged as she walked away, carrying the weight of all the help she couldn't give. I walked into the station, expecting another quiet morning, but instead found Angela standing over Knox's desk with a stack of personnel files spread out like evidence at a crime scene. Her face had that tight, controlled expression I was starting to recognize as barely contained anger. Harper. Perfect timing. Angela didn't look up from the files. Knox was just explaining why Officer Martinez's transfer paperwork shows he went to Bangor PD, but Bangor PD has no record of him ever working there. Knox sat behind his desk, looking like a man who'd been caught in a lie he'd been hoping to avoid forever. "Angela, those files are." Angela pulled out another folder, because that's what Officer Chen's records are too. Says he transferred to Augusta, but his wife told me yesterday that she hasn't heard from him in 3 years. Not a word since he left Millfield. My stomach dropped. I'd known Martinez had transferred after laughing about the gravel road figure, but I'd never questioned the details. Why would I? People left small towns for bigger departments all the time. "How many?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Angela's finger traced down a handwritten list. 7 officers in the past, 10 years, all supposedly transferred to other departments. None of them actually arrived at their new jobs. Knox was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands like they might provide better answers than his mouth could. "Some officers don't adapt well to the requirements of working in Millfield." "Don't adapt well?" Angela's voice climbed higher. "Knox. These people didn't just quit, they vanished. Their families don't know where they are. The families were told their loved ones needed to start fresh somewhere new. Clean breaks are sometimes necessary." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "You lied to their families. I protected their families from information that would only cause more pain." Before Angela could respond, the station door opened and Sophia walked in carrying what looked like an entire archive box. She took one look at the tension in the room and hesitated. "I can come back later if number." Angela gestured her over. "Actually, your timing is perfect. We're discussing the real consequences of breaking the rules." Sophia set the box down and pulled out a leather-bound journal that looked older than the building we were sitting in. "That's actually why I'm here. I found the original documentation of how the rules were established." She opened the journal carefully, revealing pages of handwritten notes in faded ink. This belonged to Sheriff William Hayes, who worked here from 1962 to 1987. He documented everything. The incidents, the negotiations, the agreements, negotiations. I leaned forward despite myself. The rules weren't developed through trial and error like we thought. They were negotiated deliberately between Sheriff Hayes and representatives of what he calls the established residents. Angela looked between the journal and Knox representatives. Sophia turned to a page marked with a red ribbon. Hayes writes, about a series of meetings that took place in 1978 after 7 people disappeared in 2 months. He described sitting down with entities he could communicate with to establish boundaries that both sides could live with. Knox had gone very still. Sophia, where did you find that journal? In the basement of the Historical Society, filed under Municipal Records Miscellaneous. It was sitting right there with budget reports and zoning documents. It was supposed to be destroyed when Hayes retired. Well, it wasn't. Sophia flipped through more pages and it explains everything. The 3 a.m. rule exists because that's when they conduct what Hayes calls essential activities that humans shouldn't witness. The Blackwater Creek calls are recruitment attempts. They're looking for people who will respond to distress calls without backup. Angela's pen was moving rapidly across her notepad. Recruitment for what? Hayes doesn't say exactly, but he mentions officers who joined the established residence after breaking certain protocols. The cold feeling in my chest spread to my arms. Joined them. Look at this entry from October 1978. Sophia read directly from the journal. Officer Thompson approached the gravel road figure despite explicit instructions. Found him 3 days later standing with them at the forest edge. He acknowledged my presence but did not respond to verbal commands. I've concluded that Thompson is no longer available for human duties. Angela set down her pen. Thompson didn't transfer. He became one of them. According to Hayes, yes, the rules aren't just about avoiding danger. They're about avoiding recruitment. Knox finally spoke, his voice heavy with something that might have been relief. Now you understand why some information is better kept confidential. No. Angela stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. Now I understand why you've been lying to us. These aren't just survival tactics. They're the terms of a treaty with entities that can turn human beings into something else. I stared at the journal, thinking about every officer I'd known who'd left Millfield. Martinez, who'd laughed about the rules. Chen, who'd looked at the window tapper. 3 others whose names I barely remembered, because Knox had always made their departures sound routine. How many of our missing officers are still out there? I asked. Hayes documented 4 confirmed cases of officers joining the established residence. The others, Knox shrugged, some genuinely transferred. Some broke rules that resulted in different consequences. Different how? Some violations result in recruitment. Others result in what Hayes calls permanent silence. Still others lead to complete disappearance with no trace left behind. Angela was pacing now, her analytical mind working through the implications. So when Harper broke the little girl rule 3 years ago, she risked being recruited, silenced, or disappeared entirely. Yes. Then why is she still here? Still human? Knox looked at me, and I felt the weight of a secret I'd been carrying for 3 years pressing against my chest. Because Harper's violation was unique. Unique. How? I closed my eyes, knowing I couldn't avoid this conversation any longer because the little girl looked exactly like my sister Emma. The silence that followed felt like a physical thing, heavy and uncomfortable. Angela stopped pacing. Sophia looked up from the journal. Knox nodded like he'd been waiting for me to admit this for years. Your sister? Angela's voice was careful, like she was approaching something fragile. Emma died in a car accident when she was 8. I was supposed to pick her up from school that day, but I had to work late. She walked home instead, and I opened my eyes, focusing on the coffee stain on Knox's desk rather than the faces around me. The little girl at the train tracks had Emma's face, Emma's hair, Emma's white dress from her first communion. So you approached her because you thought she was your sister? I approached her because for 30 seconds I forgot she was dead. Knox leaned forward. The established residents sometimes use personal connections to test the boundaries of our agreement. They wanted to know if Harper's emotional attachment would override her training. It did override my training, but you survived the test. That's what matters. Angela sat back down, processing this new information. The entities aren't just following rules. They're actively testing them, testing us. According to Hayes, yes, they probe for weaknesses in our resolve, looking for officers who might be suitable for recruitment or who might destabilize the agreement through emotional responses. Sophia turned to another marked page. Hayes writes, about the importance of emotional discipline. He says, the established residents are particularly drawn to officers who carry unresolved grief or trauma. I felt exposed, like everyone in the room could see the guilt and loss I'd been carrying for 15 years. So they targeted me specifically, probably, but you passed their test by not trying to touch or communicate with the entity, even though you approached it. I wanted to touch her. The admission came out quieter than I'd intended. I wanted to hug her and tell her I was sorry for being late, but you didn't. No, because even looking like Emma, she felt wrong, cold, like she was wearing my sister's face, but wasn't actually her. Angela was taking notes again, but her handwriting was shakier now. So the rules protect us from recruitment, but they also protect the entities from us discovering too much about their nature. Exactly. It's a mutual agreement. We don't interfere with their activities and they don't actively hunt us. Hunt us? Knox gestured at the journal. Read Hayes's accounts of what happened before the rules were established. The entities weren't content to coexist peacefully. They were actively predatory. Sophia found another section and read aloud. The established residents view humans as a resource to be harvested when needed. The agreement limits their harvesting. To volunteers and rule breakers protecting the general population from systematic predation. Volunteers. Angela looks sick. People who seek them out deliberately. Urban explorers, paranormal investigators, teenagers on dares. The entities are allowed to recruit anyone who comes looking for them intentionally. I thought about all the missing person reports we'd filed over the years. Hikers who'd ignored trail warnings. College students who'd come to Millfield specifically because of internet rumors about supernatural activity. We'd always assumed they'd gotten lost or moved on to other towns. They didn't get lost, I said. They found exactly what they were looking for, and the entities found new recruits who came willingly, which satisfies their needs without violating. The agreement, Angela closed her notepad and looked around at all of us. So our job isn't law enforcement, it's treaty maintenance. It's both, Knox said. We handle normal police work, but we also ensure that both sides continue to respect the boundaries that keep this town livable. And when officers can't handle that responsibility, they become casualties of a conflict most people don't know exists. The station felt different now, like we were sitting in a command center for a war rather than a small-town police department. Everything I had thought I understood about my job, my role, my purpose in Millfield had shifted into something larger and more dangerous. Tomorrow night, Angela said, standing up and straightening her uniform. I want to see the boundaries of our territory. I want to understand exactly what we're protecting and what we're protecting it from. Knox nodded. Harper can show you the patrol routes that mark the edges of the agreement. As Angela gathered her things and headed out, I realized that she'd crossed some invisible line in her understanding of our work. She wasn't just learning to survive in Millfield anymore. She was learning to be a guardian of something much bigger than herself. Harper Knox said after Angela left, "You did the right thing telling her about Emma. Did I? Or did I just give the entities more information they can use? Against us? You gave Angela the context she needs to understand why the rules matter on a personal level. That's going to keep her alive." I hoped he was right. But as I headed out to start my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that every truth we shared made us more vulnerable to entities that had been studying human weakness for over a century. I pulled into the station parking lot at sunset, watching Angela check her gear with the methodical precision that had become second nature over the past few weeks. She wasn't the nervous rookie who'd fumbled with her badge anymore. Her movements were confident, purposeful, like someone who understood exactly what her job required. "Ready for another night of treaty maintenance?" she asked, sliding into the passenger seat. That's one way to put it. I started the engine and pulled onto Main Street, where normal people were finishing normal dinners and settling in for normal evenings, though I still think of it as keeping everyone alive. We drove past the Methodist church where we'd first encountered the window tapper, then through the residential streets where porch lights created small islands of safety in the growing darkness. Angela had stopped asking questions about every shadow and started recognizing the difference between ordinary night sounds and something that required attention. "Knox radioed earlier," she said, checking her notepad. "Lauren's working late at the school again, deep cleaning the gymnasium." I nodded, turning toward the elementary school where warm light spilled from the janitor's office windows. Lauren was there as promised, moving efficiently through her evening routine of mopping floors and checking locks. When she spotted our patrol car, she raised her hand in the familiar two-finger wave that meant everything was secure on her end. "She's been doing this for 12 years, I told Angela, keeping the school safe so kids can learn without worrying about things they shouldn't have to understand yet. How many people in town know the truth enough? Not everyone needs the complete picture, but enough people understand their role in keeping things balanced." We continued our patrol through streets that looked perfectly ordinary, but carried the weight of decades of careful negotiation. Every route we drove had been mapped against Sophia's incident reports. Every turn calculated to respect boundaries that existed whether we could see them or not. "I've been thinking about what Knox said," Angela said as we passed the old train. "Tracks about the rules representing mutual respect rather than just survival tactics. And it makes sense. We're not hiding from them or fighting them. We're coexisting with neighbors who happen to be something other than human." I slowed the car, considering her words. Neighbors who can turn people into something else if they break the lease agreement. "Every neighborhood has its rules. Don't play music too loud. Keep your lawn maintained. Don't approach the entities during their active hours." Angela's tone was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing homeowner association bylaws. "The consequences here are just more permanent." We drove in comfortable silence for a while, both of us scanning the darkness with eyes that had learned to recognize when something was watching back. The radio stayed quiet. No false distress calls from Blackwater Creek. No reports of tall figures on gravel roads. Just the ordinary business of keeping a small town safe. Harper Angela said as we turned. "Onto Elm Street. Do you ever regret staying here, knowing what you know, dealing with what you deal with?" I thought about that question while we passed houses where families were watching television and helping kids with homework, completely unaware that their peaceful evening was protected by rules negotiated through blood and disappearances. "Used to think about leaving," I admitted, especially after the thing with Emma's face. "Knox offered to help me transfer somewhere normal, somewhere I could just chase speeders and break up bar fights. But you stayed." "I stayed because this place demands something most places don't." "What's that?" "Complete honesty about what the world actually contains." I pulled over near the town limits where pine trees created a dark wall against the star-filled sky. Most people get to pretend that reality is safe and predictable and follows rules they understand. We don't get that luxury. Angela nodded slowly. "And you prefer knowing the truth. I prefer being useful in a place where my knowledge matters. Where following the rules I've learned keeps people safe in ways they'll never understand. Even though it means carrying all that weight. The weight's lighter now that you're here to help carry it." We sat quietly for a moment, watching the tree, line for movement. That might indicate we were being observed. Nothing stirred except ordinary wind through ordinary branches, but we both knew that didn't mean we were alone. "I called my brother yesterday," Angela said suddenly. "Marcus, the one I told you about, who sees things other people dismiss. How's he doing?" "Better. I told him about a town where people take those experiences seriously, where seeing things others can't see is considered valuable rather than crazy." "What did he say?" "He asked if there were job openings." I laughed, despite myself. "We could probably use someone with his particular skills." That's what I told him. Maybe someday when he's ready. The radio crackled to life with a routine traffic stop on the other side of town. Normal police work that reminded us we still handled ordinary problems alongside the extraordinary ones. We responded with our location and continued patrol. 2 officers protecting a community that trusted us to maintain balances they couldn't see. As we drove past Blackwater Creek, Angela pointed to the water reflecting moonlight between the trees. It's beautiful here, you know. Even knowing what we know, especially knowing what we know. Most beautiful places hide their dangers. Here, the dangers are part of the beauty. Like knowing that something ancient and powerful chose to share this space with us instead of simply taking it. Exactly. We completed our patrol as dawn approached, driving routes that had become as familiar as breathing. The town looked peaceful in the early morning light. A small Maine community where people worked hard, raised families, and lived good lives protected by agreements they'd never need to understand. One more question, Angela said as we headed back to the station. Do you think we're the good guys in this arrangement? I considered that while we passed the elementary school where Lauren was finishing her night shift, the Methodist church where we'd learned to sit still and wait, the train tracks where I'd seen my sister's face on something, that wasn't my sister. I think we're the people who chose to take responsibility for something bigger than ourselves, I said finally. Whether that makes us good guys or just necessary ones, I'm not sure it matters. Angela nodded, understanding, settling over her features, like someone accepting a weight she was strong enough to carry. I can live with being necessary. As we pulled into the station parking lot, the sun was rising over Blackwater Creek, painting the water gold and making the whole town look like something from a postcard. Just another beautiful morning in a place where the impossible was simply part of daily life, protected by people who'd learned that some truths were worth the cost of knowing them. Same time tomorrow? Angela asked, gathering her gear. Same. Time tomorrow? I agreed, watching her walk to her car with the confident stride of someone who'd found her place in the world, even if that place required her to coexist with entities that could steal human faces and turn officers into something other than human. I sat in the parking lot for a few extra minutes, watching the town wake up around me. Millfield looked exactly like what it was, a small community where people cared about each other and worked together to keep everyone safe. The fact that some of those people weren't technically human anymore didn't change the fundamental truth of what we were protecting. It just made the protection more necessary.